I am live.
Hello, and welcome to the Blind Spot live broadcast. I guess nobody's watching yet, so we'll just wait a few minutes because my co-host is still missing. Hello, Josh, where are you? I'm joined where? Hello, Josh, where are you? Let's see if we've got anyone around. No, not yet. I'm joined where? Oh, hello, Josh. That's not, one shouldn't have the actual thing at the back because you have an echo then. Anyway, so Craig, you are a energy expert, I think is fair to say. Why don't you introduce yourself? Because you will probably do a better job of it than me.
So I'm Craig Pirrong. I'm professor of finance at the Bauer College of Business, University of Houston. I'm also the director of the Gutierrez, formerly Global Energy Management Institute at the University of Houston. I've done academic research since I was a small child, going back 35 years. On various commodity-related issues, particularly on energy-related issues, including electricity, natural gas, LNG, and things of that nature. So that's me.
Perfect. I'm trying to find the best backdrop, but we're kind of in the way, so we'll go with this one. So Josh, you're here. Welcome.
I am here. I ran to grab lunch. We did another recording right before this, so I ran to grab lunch and got a little backed up.
Fair enough. But you are now unbacked up, I hope.
I'm unbacked up. Yeah, that's not a toilet joke.
So, yeah. Well, I'm glad that two minds were thinking in that direction. But so presumably you're not in the UK then if you just had lunch.
No, I suppose by your accent, I assume you're not also, or are you?
No, I'm in Houston, Texas, but I'm a Chicagoan originally.
It's a great place. Chicago's a terrible place, but Houston's a great place.
That's why I'm in Houston.
So we've already done the introduction, but I thought we would just like mess about whilst somebody actually comes and watches us, maybe. Let me just take this. We've got nobody watching so far, which is great. You know, we've got 11 watching.
I'm working on it.
11. But this will stay on the podcast channel, and hopefully we'll get a few more views in that. We're averaging about 1,000 views so far, so not too bad.
I'm jumping into Clubhouse to get people in.
Oh, go on. Yes.
As some banter, Craig. My uncle lives down there near Houston. Actually, he works for Wycliffe.
Okay, cool.
So, what is that?
It's a Bible translator organization.
Ah, interesting.
They do translations for like tribes in Africa.
Yep.
Brilliant. We've got our first comment, so that's great. So I think we can now start with some actual analysis. So the reason I brought in Craig is because obviously huge story in energy, generally speaking. Like, I'm fed up of saying that this was obvious in February, but and I would want to shoot myself. Like, if I was somebody else and I heard me saying what I keep saying, I would be as annoyed. So I do go on about this a little bit, but I do think it was really obvious in February. And I am incredibly shocked that like the world's regulators and policy people and leaders all around are kind of pretending that this wasn't obvious. For me, are they incompetent? Are they willfully ignoring things? I really don't. What is going on, Craig? Like, how come the political kind of class is so behind the curve on the energy shortages they themselves have kind of like amplified through policies that I think were visibly going to create these constraints?
Well, so I think that's the major part of the problem, because having admitted that or acknowledged that there was a problem in February, you can even go back to September of 2021, because that's when sort of the first sort of gas price and electricity price spike started in Europe. And that was when there was a sort of a margin crisis in European energy derivatives markets, and the commodity traders were going and asking for ECB support and things of that nature. So this has been on the radar for a long time, but precisely because it is largely the consequence of past policies that that those in charge don't want to admit it. Essentially have it coming up and say, "Oh, February, oh, we screwed up. Well, sorry about that, but here we are." That's just something that politicians are loath to do.
Oh, Izabella, she keeps going on mute. She hates the sound of her own voice.
Sorry, you're right. So I did do that a bit of the last time, mainly because Dario was in the building and he was heavy breathing, so I didn't want anyone else.
Oh, he's one of those, huh?
But so I think it's fair to say, Josh, that you are not an energy expert apart from in Bitcoin mining. And,
are you kidding me? No, that's right. I'm not.
But this is the point of the blind spot podcast, Craig. It's that we try to bridge different sectors, and so we are energy geeks. Well, you are obviously much more so than I am.
You two are energy geeks.
Yeah, we are. Josh is not. So
but a new skill I've learned about Izabella.
We want to communicate to people who are, specialize in different asset classes who maybe aren't so expert. But the one thing that interests me about you specifically is that you're also an economist. And what I'm finding, and I don't know why, but the economic profession generally seems to me to be incredibly ignorant for some reason now about how commodity markets operate. Why do you think that is? Am I making a fair assertion here? Because I really think like Janet Yellen should know better about what's going on, and she doesn't seem to. Why is that?
Well, so there are a couple parts about it. First of all, the energy market is a very big and diverse thing in and of itself. And so one part of that means that, that expertise tends to be highly specialized. So, for example, there are a lot of economists that have done really, interesting work on how electricity markets work, for example, and help design electricity markets. But they tend to be in their own little silo, and they don't really necessarily interact with the economics profession at large. Another part of it is that a lot of economists are like the drunks looking for their wallet under the lamppost. They go where the data is available, and that has always been, the equity markets, bond markets, FX markets, things of that nature, where the grist to do empirical research is readily available, and that's not particularly the case for commodity markets, particularly the physical commodity markets. And also so for example, I'm a professor of finance. And I'm really sort of an outlier in terms of the finance profession. I mean, recently there's been more of a migration of finance people into studying commodity issues, but it's basically been weirdos like me that have been involved in it. And so it's just, and there's a sort of a feedback loop. The way academia works is that, people publish in a particular area, so then certain stuff gets published, and other people try to publish there, and it sort of feeds on itself. And until you get sort of a critical mass of people studying these sorts of issues, it's not really going to get traction in journals, and that, like I say, sort of feeds on itself. So I think it's a sort of combination of factors.
Craig, I think, this is actually a question. I'll tell you where I get interested in the discussion as a person who's not, who doesn't know energy as well. I'm always very interested in this idea that politicians and political appointments are completely ignorant about something, yet go on TV and make announcements and pronouncements as if they know everything about it. And I think this last year, there's particularly with regard to inflation, there's been this very obvious sort of unveiling of economists working in the government, that they really just seem to be completely ignorant of the future, which is kind of what economics is supposed to do, is help us to predict what's coming. But Isabella's right, and I think you're right, that this energy stuff is so obvious that an idiot like myself could see it coming from 10 miles. I'm not like a goose that can only see a car when it's like 5 feet away and then I get hit. Like, this seemed obvious to me, but Janet Yellen, these other people in the government making pronouncements, or in Europe where they're capping prices, like, they seem like geese. They seem like they can't see the car until it's 5 feet in front of them and then runs them over. Why is that? Like, what's the deal? Explain to me.
Well, so as an economist, I always look at things in terms of incentives. And so basic, incentives and scarcity. And so if you think about a policymaker, their bandwidth, their capacity to evaluate things is relatively limited. There are competing demands on their time, and they have an incentive to focus on the current thing. And it's until something becomes the new current thing and hits them in the head, they don't really pay any attention to it. I mean, and it is kind of shocking. I got a call. I guess it was maybe it was right around the time. I guess it was around February, March, when the oil markets were going crazy, the grain markets were going crazy. I got a call from somebody that is one of Yellen's staffers, and they say, "Hey, the secretary has to make a presentation to the president tomorrow on oil markets." And then the questions that I was asked were so astoundingly simple that I was just gobsmacked. I mean, just like, so this was sort of the person that's supposed to be advising the Secretary of the Treasury, and they starting from knowledge base 0. And why did they need to build that knowledge base? Oh my God, they got a problem right now. So,
you understand the American government, though? Is that the effect of Janet Yellen being just a moron, or is that an effect of the fact that we have young staffers doing this work who literally are trying to build a deck and help her kind of catch up, and they start from 0, so they presume she also starts from 0. What's the problem?
Janet Yellen isn't a moron. She knows her stuff. Come on.
I'm not saying she's a moron. I'm asking, is that what's the reason for this? Is it because she's a moron, or is it because it's young staffers? Is there a different reason? What is it?
So there's always worthwhile distinguishing sort of intelligence or stupidity on the one hand from ignorance on the other. And so I think I'll say a couple of things. First of all, I think Janet Yellen is a very accomplished economist in her area, but I think that that like a lot of economists and a lot of people generally, she's very specialized, and so her knowledge may be very deep in a particular area, but particularly narrow. And so so that this is sort of outside of her scope. And that's why you're supposed to have staffers that can sort of help smart people figure out new things. But again, and this was my experience. This has been my experience going back, I said, 15 years or so, going back to the financial crisis and around that period of time, and looking at policymakers trying to grapple with things like clearing or the way the derivatives markets work. Sort of these relatively arcane areas that sometimes become important are outside of their scope as well. And so, we essentially have the blind leading the blind. And I will say another thing about Janet Yellen, which is that she's also sort of completely gone political. I mean, she does say a lot of things and advocate a lot of policies that as an economist she has to know make no sense. Why? Because she's advancing the party line.
That's kind of what I was asking as well. I was what's the reason? Because I tend to agree. I don't know much about Janet Yellen's history, right? That's something an economist, economists, when they heard her appointment name, probably were I know who that is. Whereas most Americans,
she's married to?
George Stephanopoulos.
George Akerlof. Got the first name right.
Did I? I pulled that out of my butt.
Yeah.
I thought you were actually going to answer it correctly for a second.
So who won the Nobel Prize?
Yeah, so he's a Nobel Prize winning economist behind
so
one of your favorite economic theories, I think.
She's the unaccomplished.
He did Market for Lemons, right? Didn't he?
Say again?
He did Market for Lemons, right?
That's right. That's So asymmetric information, adverse selection. Yeah. So he was sort of one of the first.
Did he also write Fishing for Fools?
Say it?
Was that him? I know I've read one of his books, and the Market for Lemons I know very well, but I'm trying to remember which book I also read that was his. But I did not know that she was married to him at all. I did not know that. That's new information to me. Going to synthesize that.
You also have to So I also have this visual image of Janet Yellen, which sort of in some respects I can't escape whenever I think about it, which was in 2013, I was invited by the Fed Board of Governors to make a presentation to the governors about clearing and clearing mandates. And so
clearing of energy clearing or like financial clearing?
Yeah, so basically this was, so after the financial crisis, the solution to all our crisis problems was going to be centralized clearing of derivatives. And so energy was part of that, but it was, sort of broader. And so, Janet Yellen, so she's about 5 feet tall, maybe. And she came up dressed in a green and red velvet outfit that the whole package reminded me of something out of Elf, but so I can't sort of escape that.
Isabella, I just checked. Fishing for Fools was Akerlof. Ha.
Yeah, I think that was it. I don't know if that was. No, that was Jeremy Siegel, I think. Or
it was
no, it was Robert Schiller and Akerlof together, double byline. Yeah, so it was indeed, which is why. They're smart people. I mean, this is the interesting thing. So given that we've established that Josh is not an expert, although potentially more of an expert than a politicized Janet Yellen, let's just break down what's been going on for those watching. So we were already in a tight energy market coming into the Ukraine war, Russia war, right? So I think we last did a Twitter Spaces, must have been around 2021 Q4 maybe, when gas prices in Europe had gone mental, right? And this, I think, was down to two main issues coming out of COVID, energy rebound demand, but also just the accumulation of all the consequences of net zero and the underinvestment that had been happening in fossil fuels in Europe as a result of that, right? So that was already an energy tight situation. I think when we last spoke, Craig, we were saying that things would get pretty peaky around February, which was obviously interesting because that's when Putin chose to he knew Europe was potentially at its weakest. But even then, we were coming out of the winter, spring on the horizon. Energy markets are obviously very seasonal in Europe. Throughout, if you're here in Europe, like even in the summer, we've been having energy issues. Prices are now parabolic. Is that fair to say? I think it is in some areas. There's real concern here in Europe for our American watchers that we will be short of gas and short of power. And diesel is looking very choppy as well. So rationing is suddenly in the frame for the first time since the war, basically. And we are hearing all the time from all these politicians coming up with excellent ideas for how to mitigate these effects, which are now compounded, of course, by sanctions. And sanctions are the number one, like what was already a bad situation, Craig, is that fair to say, has now been compounded and made into a ridiculous one. But what we want to discuss specifically now is the policies that they are throwing at this problem here in Europe, which are focused around energy price caps and the suspension of markets, like I believe the power market, they're talking about suspending that. And what else? Let's start with those two. So, Craig, what do you think? Where should we start? It's such a rich topic.
Well, where I would start is the following: is that essentially, as we've been talking, and as you just outlined, Europe is facing a situation of acute scarcity due to a confluence of factors that have been accumulating for years and months, and so then the consequence of those has been to cause stratospheric energy prices. So, for example, 10 days ago or so, the price of electricity in Germany reached 1,000 euros per megawatt hour. And now I can say it reached $1,000 per megawatt hour, basically, because essentially 1 for 1 now. The prices aren't as high in the UK, but still they're also stratospheric by historical standards. And so now policymakers are scrambling to figure out what to do with it. And the basic problem is that they can't solve the underlying problem. The scarcity is baked in. There's nothing they can do about it. At least over the relevant horizon of the coming winter or even the coming year. So I sort of visualize this like a game of musical chairs. But the problem is that there's not just one more person than there are chairs. There are like 30 more people than there are chairs. And so then the question becomes, well, we can't add more chairs. So how are we going to divide those chairs up amongst all the people that want them? And that's all of these policies are essentially ways to try to do that. And being a political situation, what's really driving it is that sort of the specific policies is that politics is basically all redistributive. So basically there's a lot of pain around right now. And so it's basically a question of how to allocate the pain. Even though all of the alternatives will probably cause future dysfunctions. But again, being politicians, their time horizons tend to be relatively short, and so they're just looking at ways to sort of address the distributive and political short-term problems.
How much is the scarcity self-imposed?
Well, this, what did Freud say? Something's overdetermined. Well, this is sort of an overdetermined problem. And so, a lot of it self-imposed as Izabella just noted, as a consequence of net zero and policies related to that. So, I mean, when we had that podcast, I think that was October 2021. The gas shortage then was in large part due to the fact that there had been a shortage, or essentially a necessity of utilizing gas to generate electricity then, because there'd been a wind drought, not just in the UK, but in Europe. And so gas inventories were drawn down in the fall, which is an unusual time to do that, because of net zero. Also, there's been sort of an underinvestment, as he also noted, in fossil fuels generally, but also the decisions of the Germans to do things like shut off their nukes, and the French all of a sudden becoming incompetent at running nuclear plants. And so, again, I mean, there is sort of a concatenation of sort of long-term policy errors and sort of short-term, errors that really laid the foundation for this. And then, so Europe was already in an extremely fraught situation, and then the war happens, and essentially the restriction in supplies of energy from Russia, which now in terms of gas look like they're going to become 100%, huge problems.
And then follow up, what do you think the future is for net zero policies?
Well, von der Leyen, excuse me, she's not Dutch, she's German. Von der Leyen came out this morning and gave a EU policy speech, and one of the main policy initiatives that she offered was to increase investments in renewables. And so, yes, and you look at the Green Party's part of the German government. You look at I'm not as so you look at a lot of European countries. They're basically saying, hey, let's go more towards renewables, not away from renewables. Because our problem is that we're overly dependent on fossil fuels, and so we need to reduce that dependence. So, as somewhat of an outsider looking at Europe, it appears that they're actually doubling down on renewables for not just net zero reasons, but for energy security reasons.
I mean, this doubling down, I mean, I haven't looked at the renewable situation in you know, I look, as far as I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, renewables are not there yet. Like, so we've reduced their price. A lot of that is to do with the degree to which China is a major supplier of renewables, especially solar. But they don't necessarily solve the base energy problem, which means they you need the sun to shine, you need the wind to be blowing, and the so-called intermittent power issue remains on the table. You're based in Houston. This was very clearly visible. When was it? Last year. When was the big? It must have been
February 2021.
February 2021. Right. So the wind didn't blow because of the wind, because everything got frozen. Right. So you had massive energy shortages and blackouts. Right. How long were you out without?
I was off and on without power for about 30 hours.
So that's a significant wedge of time, enough for all your food to defrost.
Yeah. Well, that I could put outside because it was really cold. But but yeah, no, it was it's living without power for even I also had an issue where almost exactly, I guess it was 14 years ago now, September of second half of September 2008. It was Hurricane Ike. We were out power for about a week. But that wasn't really renewables related. But yeah. So yes, the problem with renewable, variety of problems with renewables is that they're intermittent and they're diffuse, so they're definitely not there yet. And I mean, you look at. I'll make a couple points. First of all, the common thing is, renewables are becoming competitive. Well, if they're becoming competitive, why do they need stimulus and support and subsidy? So if you look at the grotesquely misnamed Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which was really sort of the Green New Deal in drag, essentially it adds a whole amount of new subsidies. Well, if for renewables, if renewables are sort of competitive, you wouldn't need those new subsidies. You look also another indicator. There's a very strong positive correlation between the fraction of power generated by renewables and electricity costs. So you look at Germany, relatively high penetration of renewables, extremely expensive power prices even before all this hit the fan. But it's also similar in Denmark, California, in the United States. And also you just look at the numbers. If the total amount of renewables now is only a fraction of the increase in energy consumption over the last 5 or 6 years. All right, so it's a small fraction of total energy consumption.
So we're chasing our tail in some ways.
Yeah. No, I mean it's like the Red Queen, and got to run twice as fast as to keep up or whatever, and so yes, I mean it is not a winning race, and the problem is that the disincentives for fossil fuels have led to essentially a slowdown in fossil fuel. I also say nuclear production and growth that is occurring too soon for renewables to fill the gap. So the idea was we're going to be in an energy transition, and that we're going to transition from fossil fuel related energy to non-fossil fuel related energy. And it's a lot easier to crater fossil fuels than it is to replace them with renewables. We could go on hours about this, but I mean it's just that's part of the problem is that we sort of threw out stuff that we need, or throwing out stuff that we need before we have what we need to replace.
I thought it might be fun to just go through a few paragraphs of her statement and just get your take on whether it's a porky pie or whether it's the truth, because it seems to me to be quite loaded with what I would call disinformation, actually. Um, but
From the government?
well, from this is the EU, right?
Well,
So yeah, the government.
Science then.
But I just thought let's start with because it's words are, you can say all sorts of things, but does it really mean, is it really a fair reflection of what's going on? So this paragraph struck me as interesting. So she says, but we are also seeing that the Russian manipulation of the gas market has spillover effects on the electricity market. So there is on the one hand the Russian manipulation, but there are also other factors during this summer. So first of all, would you describe what's going on as Russian manipulation? Like, is that because you are, I think it's fair to say, a world expert on commodity market manipulation. Does this qualify as market manipulation by the Russians?
It sort of represents, an exercise of market power, which is one form of manipulation. But I mean, yeah. So what gets me about this one, this reminds me of the thing. Mommy, no fair. Johnny hit me back. So I mean, this was again in terms of predictable policy, on the behalf of the Russians. I mean, what did the Europeans expect? Putin would do, particularly when his original military ambitions were not realized. So I mean, so that's so whining about that is problematic.
Izabella, play my clip.
Oh yeah. And Josh has handily put this into the.
We're not going to put up with it, these horrible prices, much longer. Reliance on a single foreign supplier can leave a nation vulnerable to extortion and intimidation. That is why we congratulate European states such as Poland for leading the construction of a Baltic pipeline so that nations are not dependent on Russia to meet their energy needs. Germany will become totally dependent on Russian energy if it does not immediately change course. Here in the Western Hemisphere, we are committed to maintaining our independence from the encroachment of expansionist foreign powers. It has been the formal policy of our country since President Monroe that we reject the interference of foreign nations in this hemisphere and in our own affairs.
So there you go.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
look, as you were saying, it was not predictable.
Well, what's funny is that when was that? Do you know when that was? That clip?
I think that was in September 2020.
Right. So what's funny is I think that at the time that would have
September
been
25th, 2018.
Oh, 2018. Okay.
So I think it's fair to say that at that time that would have been
a longer glide path then.
But it would have been construed as a porky pie, right? That Trump was telling a porky pie. And just for the context of viewers, I think it's fair to say that none of us in this chat are Putin apologists. I mean, Craig, you have a long-standing record of hating Putin. I mean, you've got your blog as promo FICO evidence of that, right? Josh, you also are. You may be.
I love
Trump
Putin,
apologist, but you're definitely.
No, I'm not a Putin apologist, and I very much even am one of the rare people on the Trump spectrum, who I like him, who actually very much support us funding the Ukraine war.
And I'm Polish, so I think I just wanted to put that out there because when you
I'm Polish. People, when I was a kid, people like we'd play soccer, and they would say they go around like, "Is anyone here good at soccer?" If it was a group that nobody had ever met, and they'd go, "Are you good at soccer? Are you good at soccer?" They would get to me, and I go, "Well, I am Brazilian." And then I wouldn't answer the question, and then I get drafted first, and they would always be disappointed. Like, it's not my fault.
You're
You're a racist.
I'm definitely not pro-Russian. So, or Putin, or like, again, I differentiate between the people. There are many Russian, liberals, and there are many good Russians. You can't generalize the whole, again.
But they're not
Polish
sending
people
their
do.
best. They're sending the rapists.
Yeah. But I just wanted to put that into context, because I think now we are free to talk about this without being deemed, because that is the favorite thing. Like, if you criticize the sanctions or any part of this, you are immediately classified a Putin apologist, and I think it's fair to say none of us are. We're just trying to be pragmatic and realistic about what's going on. So with that out of the way, what Trump said was pretty. I mean, given that the assertion is he's not the sharpest, in the person around. If it was obvious to him,
well, I actually want to follow up with that. What is the difference between the way Trump? Because I don't think Trump's ideas are Trump's ideas for the most part. So, like, what is different about the information gathering that someone like Trump did for a speech like that than like what you experienced with Yellen? And I asked it because, like, to me, that the information gathering and the synthesis seems like a really crucial part of how our politicians both give rhetoric as well as construct law and accept what lobbyists, et cetera, are saying about things. So, like, what was different?
Well, I think what was different was where Trump was coming from, in the sense that, so Trump, because of the whole MAGA thing, it was like America first. And so he had he and Merkel hated one another, and he hated the fact that the Germans free rode on NATO. He was sort of an alliance skeptic. So I think he came to us from a situation where he was very so that he was very sensitive to the Germans in particular and their relationship with the Russians. And I think what the difference was for both he and his people, whoever wrote that speech, were just saying, hey, we're spending all this money to defend the Germans from the Russians, and we've done so for years. And here you are, basically, mainlining German gas. Why should we be doing that? So I think it was just that the ground was prepared. It was very fertile ground for that information to tickle Trump's fans.
What's priceless in that video is the German reaction. I presume that those people there are the Germans.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the guys was asked about that, and he refused to answer. He refused to see. So one of the Germans that was in that video was just a couple days ago. You can probably Google it and find it. And basically, stonewalled the answers.
So going back to Miss van der Leyen, van der Leyen, I should say. So where were we? We're here. So she goes, we see the effects of climate change. We see the drought. Hydropower has been reduced by 26% in the European Union and by 46% in Portugal. And we have the fact that we have less nuclear electricity in the European Union at the moment. That sentence doesn't even make sense, but never mind. And this is the reason why we are now confronted with astronomical electricity prices for households and companies, and with an enormous market volatility. Therefore, we will put forward a set of 5 different immediate measures. We'll come to that, but there seems to be a deflection away from the sanctions to climate change being the cause of our energy problems.
Yes.
Do you think that's what's going on?
Yes. So one thing always gets me about this. So it's that if somebody points out in a cold winter and makes a joking reference to, so much for global warming. Oh, how dare you confuse weather for climate? And so there's sort of an underlying presumption that droughts, which happen, maybe it's climate change has impacted the likelihood of such a drought and so on, but essentially attributing the what's going on in Europe right now to climate change is problematic to begin with. But this is part of the whole doubling down thing. Rather than saying, hey, maybe we need to rethink our incentives for energy and getting a balanced energy mix. They're trying to turn lemons into lemonade by using this to advance sort of a pre-existing agenda regarding renewables in particular.
So let's go back to her 5 measures. So they're producing 5 measures to help us through this winter of discontent. For our younger viewers, they won't remember. Maybe Josh doesn't even know about the original winter of discontent. I was born in it. I'm actually a winter of discontent baby. So there's that. Josh, are you familiar with our winter of discontent here in the UK?
The first time I ever heard the phrase was when you said we were going to talk about the winter of discontent with Craig. So I am not familiar, and I've done a lot of reading on a lot of things. So I assume, what's that?
You're not a dummy. You know your stuff. So
I am a dummy, but that's why I got to read.
But yeah, so basically, this is the thing that, from a UK lens, I think this is a reminder of the 1970s when Britain was at the lowest of the low. It had run out of empire. It had run out of any kind of discernible, comparative advantage in the economy, and we were facing the oil shock, and we ran out of fuel. This was before North Sea oil really kicked things off and helped us out of our problem. But we went to a 3-day week here in the UK, which meant that for 2 days people didn't go to work. There was no electricity. People had to hang their food outside the window in a cold, damp cloth because the refrigeration just wasn't working, stuff like that. And I think the older generation, they still remember. So every time you mention what's happening now, the old generation is like, well, we've lived through it before. It's no big problem. We got through it. We could get through it again, which is fair. But also, I think this is the point that these days, the impact of an energy, like blackouts is going to be even more impactful, I think, than it was in the 70s, right? And also, I think the financial consequences are going to be even bigger in many ways. That's my personal take. But Craig, having gone through that 30-hour blackout, I would love your tips for how to survive blackouts in Europe. What was your big learning curve? What did you learn from that experience?
That I was a good Boy Scout and planned ahead, and I was prepared, and I had some firewood that I could use in my fireplace, and
what's a fireplace?
Yeah. But is California having shortages again?
Yes. So they're having a huge heat wave there, and so they and renewables play a part of it. So when are they asking people to cut back power? They're asking people to cut back power consumption around 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Why is that? Well, because that's when solar, it's still hot. So there's, it doesn't cool down immediately when the sun starts to go down. So it's still hot. People are still using their air conditioning, but the energy coming from the sun starts to decline. And so there's this gap that tends to grow between consumption and renewables generation right around 4 or 5 in the afternoon. And so basically so they're, reliance on renewables, and particularly solar in this instance, has contributed to their fraught situation, particularly in the afternoon.
Craig, would nuclear have been able to stave off that gap? Just providing the sort of constant.
Well, so here in the United States, with nuclear, so basically any, so that's the other thing about chemical energy, whether it's generated by gas, coal, what have you, is that it's storable, and if you have the capacity, you can fire up gas generators in order to meet that. But one of the problems, and this has been a big problem in Texas, is that because of the encouragement of renewables, so basically it's made a lot of traditional sources of generation uneconomic. And so there's been less investment and actually disinvestment in some of those forms of generation. And so, yes, in a sort of a different policy environment where that stuff would have been invested in or not disinvested in, that would have been able to avoid that particular kind of problem.
So, because let's go to the measures against this. So let's give the thumbs up, thumbs down, or some sort of measure as to how effective they're likely to be. And then after we've gone through Miss von der Leyen's ones, let's look at what Liz Truss is planning for the UK and how effective that's going to be. So measure number 1, let me add it. I want to make sure everyone knows, is smart energy savings. So apparently, just to give the lowdown on what she's planning, what's changed over the summer because of the elements I was just mentioning is that we see that there is a global scarcity of energy. So whatever we do, one thing is for sure, we have to save energy, but we have to save it in a smart way, not a stupid way, because saving energy in a stupid way would be stupid. If you look at the cost of electricity, there are peak demands, and what this is what is expensive, because in these peak demands, the expensive gas comes into the market. So what we have to do is to flatten the curve. And she literally said, flatten the curve and avoid the peak demand. So we will propose a mandatory target for reducing electricity use at peak hours, and we will work very closely with member states to achieve this. So I'm going to change that strap, actually. I'm going to make it flatten the curve. Can we flatten the energy curve?
I feel like politicians learned one word during COVID, like one phrase, and now it's like, it is applicable to almost any statistical sort of meme, but it's hilarious to me how much mileage they're getting out of it.
Yep.
I mean, it's almost a joke. I mean, come on, she must have said that as a joke, right?
No, not a chance.
So I have a couple comments about that. First of all, it's not just a peak power problem. If you look at the forward, so you look at the forward price of electricity on the continent, but also in the UK, for calendar 2023, 24/7, 365, it's down. It's only 500 euros an hour. It was as high as 1,000, and that's not peak power. This is not, yes, the problem is the worst at the peak, but it's not strictly a peak problem. Number 2 is that that's just basically a lot of, sort of words and hand waving around rationing, but we're going to ration smartly. Well, people have, you had Diocletian, his name up on there, and the Edict of Maximum Prices. I mean, people for literally thousands of years, and it even goes back before that. I think that, the Code of Hammurabi essentially has price controls in it. And, so people have been trying to figure out ways to ration for time immemorial. And, there's really, there's dumb ways and really dumb ways. And there's really not necessarily any smart ways.
Right. So that's kind of feeds into measure number 2, which is they propose a cap on the revenues of companies that are producing electricity with low costs. Mm-hmm. The low carbon energy sources are making in these times because they have low costs, but they have high prices on the market, enormous revenues. Revenues they never calculated with, revenues they never dreamt of, and revenues they cannot reinvest to that extent. These revenues do not reflect the production costs. So it's now time for the consumers to benefit from the low costs of low carbon energy sources, like, for example, the renewables. We will propose to rechannel these unexpected profits to the member states so that the member states can support the vulnerable households and vulnerable companies. So having asserted that it is mainly a climate change issue, deflection, right? And that they want to solve the problem with more renewables, they're now actually going to windfall tax the lowest cost producers, which in their opinion are the renewables. But the reason they're lowest cost producers is also because they're very heavily subsidized by the taxpayers. So have I got that right? Yes,
and also coal. So coal is astoundingly profitable generation right now. So in one of my blog posts, I basically said that the what's called the dark spread, the difference between the cost of electricity, price of electricity, and the cost of coal required is like 800 euros per megawatt hour. So this goes back to the redistributive aspect of it. Okay, so that basically, politically, it's completely infeasible to have the populace at large shoulder the burden of the true cost of production and particularly the marginal cost. And so what they're going to do is that they're going to extract profits and rents from the inframarginal producers and redistribute those to consumers. Now, that's got other aspects of it too, because that's actually at odds with the smart flattening the curve thing. Because why? When you basically say, hey, consumers are not going to really see the price of power, that means that they have no incentive to reduce their consumption, which exacerbates the rationing problem. So basically, the bottom line about a lot of these policies is that it's politically infeasible to have consumers pay the price of incentivizing the marginal unit of production. And so where are we going to compensate them for that? Where are we going to get the money? Basically, one is these low-cost producers, and the other is the taxpayers generally.
But if you're taxing the renewables, like on their, amazing profits in this situation, isn't that like a double-edged sword, like economically? Because you want, like she just said, you want more new renewable energy, but then we're going to tax them more. So I'm confused.
Yeah, well, so that's and that's where the sort of the time horizon of politicians becomes in, because so basically what this is, she gave all this sort of florid language about they'd never expected to earn these profits and they're grotesque profits, blah 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 blah. But what is that saying? Well, that's saying, hey, here's the state of the world in which we really want to have this kind of generation. All right. But when we get into that state of the world, we're not going to reward you for making that investment. So it has long run consequences in terms of providing perverse incentives on what to invest in and how much to invest. But again, from a politician's perspective, hey, I'm going to be dead by them, or I'm going to be out of office. I have this near-term problem to deal with. If I'm kicking this can down the road, that's somebody else's problem.
Isn't it worse than that, though, Craig? Because like we just saw energy companies come out of a pandemic wherein they were losing money left and right. And the idea that somehow their profits are evil in retrospect, where they kept the energy grid running when oil went negative.
Yeah.
Like, to me, do they get the credit as like beneficent actors, or do they only get to be evil? Is that like
politicians have an option? They have a call option on evil, so they get to call you evil. But they never, it's not a symmetric. No. So no, I mean, nobody was crying, like you say, for energy companies in 2020 when prices were in the toilet. So
I do find it.
Oh,
sorry, I find it interesting because like during COVID, we refilled our strategic reserves basically at a cost of $0.
Yeah.
Like, we were essentially filling that thing when oil was near negative or at just a few bucks a barrel. And, nowadays, in order to like combat what's going on, not only do we have policies that are sort of stopping the production of oil, but we have these policies now that are drawing down the strategic petroleum reserves in the U.S. in order to sort of to catch up the backwardation, I guess, is the way that it would be. Is that correct? Is that how I would say that?
Yeah.
To flatten the curve.
Yeah. Well, but they said flatten the forward curve. There we go. We can make the whole thing out of this. So I wrote a book on the theory of storage. You can get it on Amazon. And I think
it was called The Bible, and it was all about Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat.
Right. And so what's the idea behind storage? Storage is to smooth out temporary fluctuations in supply. And so you draw down on storage when there's sort of a temporary demand increase or a temporary supply disruption. And the problem with drawing down on the strategic petroleum reserve now is that this is likely to be a very long duration issue. And so we sort of expended our ammo too early, if you will. So,
I mean, it's essentially a bottleneck issue, right? Like production wise, it's like a bottleneck kind of thing. There's,
right.
I mean, like I'm going to read your book, but I think I don't know if you're familiar with the book, The Goal.
Yeah.
And this, to me, like that's kind of how I've been been able to relate to this market as we've been releasing this stuff. Is I don't know much about the energy markets, but Izabella does. I know that, as do those close to her, and but I don't know much. So, but I've just been thinking about this as sort of like basically a bottleneck issue. And is that the case with regard to oil and everything else? And
Well, yeah. So no, see, that's the whole problem. So there are a lot of bottlenecks in the energy system. A lot of what's going on in Europe relates to bottlenecks upstream. But in terms of the oil market, it's more of a long run, issue. It's sort of not like a short run bottleneck. If you want to characterize it as a bottleneck, so essentially a lot of it is holdover from COVID, when there was basically no incentive to invest in drilling, even in places that have been very productive in the United States. And now, when the economic signals are basically saying, "Hey, you should reverse that," the political signals are saying the exact opposite. And so we have not seen sort of the uptick in production and drilling that you would have expected given the price rebound.
Which brings me to measure number 3, the solidarity contribution, which is one of my, I think possibly my favorite measure. And I do love that, like, it's almost a troll, like the solidarity contribution, like obviously, as I've already established, I'm Polish. So it's so nice to have all these like memories of shortages like resonate and to bring up solidarity as well. So the third measure is, she says, of course, the same goes, of course, for the unexpected profits of fossil fuel companies. Oil and gas companies have also made massive profits. Therefore, we will propose that there is a solidarity contribution for fossil fuel companies because all energy sources must help to overcome this crisis. Member states should invest these revenues to, as I said, support vulnerable households and vulnerable companies, but also to invest them in clean, homegrown energy, for example, renewables. Now, there isn't really any explanation about what a solidarity contribution is.
Right on, man.
What do you think?
Well, So again, I mean, what Willie said. Why do you rob banks? Well, because that's where the money is. So basically, what she's looking for and what Truss is looking for, where's the money? And right now, oil producers, gas producers are making a lot of money. And so she's basically extracting that. The other thing that sort of strikes me about that, on the one hand, as you noted, she's basically sort of stepping on the brakes of the incentive to invest in renewables through the item number 2, which was we're going to only provide low prices for low-cost producers. But then on the other hand, we're going to take money from oil companies and direct it to renewables. There's an element of incoherence in all of it. But the fundamental thing is that they're looking for banks to rob. They're looking for basically sources of money to pay for subsidization of consumption.
What does solidarity contribution mean, though? Does it mean like they get to figure out how much they like? Who's going to determine the size of the contribution? Does the solidarity thing imply some sort of voluntary, like, are they trying to shame these companies into doing it voluntarily? Like, what is?
No, it's compelled solidarity. We're going to make you be, So it's an Orwellian formulation.
Well, we're all in this together. That's why you got to pay.
Right.
All right. There will be a clear-cut, like, ratio of profits that they're going to effectively claw back to cover for this. It's not that because I haven't seen any specific figures in terms of percentages. So it's just this is to be determined, right?
But isn't it a dangerous territory for politicians to decide that an industry has just made too much money? It blows my mind that we're there.
Yeah. Well,
it's not a question so much as like just a comment. I just can't believe it.
Yeah, well, but I mean, you're not as old as I am, and so I lived through, as a young man in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when sort of the oil price shocks, and that was the sort of the theme back then, and so we had a windfall profits tax in the United States, and so again, I mean, politicians are like Louis Sutton; they go where the money is, so.
So measure number 4 is interesting. So obviously here in the UK, and this started as with Northern Rock, the UK was the precursor for all this. Back in 2021, our energy utility companies were already going bankrupt, and the government already had to put in some sort of guarantee because these companies were essentially selling forward energy at prices that they hadn't wholesale funded yet. Very similar to the Northern Rock scenario. But now this is a much broader problem. So measure number 4 from the EU is addressing the energy utility companies that must be supported to be able to cope with the volatility of the markets. Here it is the problem of securing futures markets, and for that liquidity is needed. These companies are currently being requested to provide unexpected large amounts of funds. Now, is that a double net? These companies are currently being, that's really bad English, which threatens their capacity not only to trade, but also the stability of the futures markets. It is a liquidity problem. Therefore, we will help to facilitate the liquidity support by member states for energy companies. We will update our temporary framework and enable us state guarantees to be delivered rapidly. So we are in the context of raising rates and trying to pull liquidity out of the system, but we're going to provide liquidity now. The liquidity, what they take here, they're going to give to the energy companies. And effectively, this is another kind of moral hazard discussion. But they are de facto inheriting the shorts and putting them onto the public balance sheet as a result of that. So, Craig, what do you think? How effective? What do you think of the policy?
Well, so I mean, so this sort of, and my cat's going to join us here. So this sort of illustrates one of the consequences of we talked about clearing earlier and sort of derivatives markets, and it's a no credit system. And theoretically, that means that there's no credit to the clearinghouse or to the exchange or what have you. But in order to make that happen, companies have to post cash margin, and the cash margin is going to be higher the bigger higher prices are, and the more volatile prices are. So so it's and so basically this is a mechanism where traditionally no credit systems have been supported indirectly by private credit. So a company borrows from a bank and then uses that money to post at a clearinghouse. Now, that venue or that avenue is largely foreclosed or tapped out. And so now, the government is going to be the provider of credit. And so, this is one thing that's probably necessary in order to prevent the system breaking down, and also potentially reducing the probability that the energy crisis will mutate into a broader financial crisis. So this is sort of a trying to preempt a Lehman moment.
So, because there was this report out on September 6th, which was, I've lost count of what day that was. Today is what? So yesterday, from Equinor, which I hadn't even realized was formerly Statoil. That somehow passed me by, but it makes sense because they obviously had to take the oil out of their name to be more ESG. Yeah. So they're now Equinor.
Do you have to report that on your ESG filings? Like, we took the oil out of our name.
I don't know. I don't know if that's true. I made that up, but maybe
it is true. It is true. No, definitely it's true.
But anyway, so they came out with this report saying that Europe faces 1.5 trillion euros worth of margin calls. That's mental. That is a Lehman moment. And
it's an orders of magnitude bigger than the Lehman moment.
Right. So
not as big as LTCM.
Well, no, it was bigger. I mean, if you look at it in retrospect, so LTCM was 24 years ago, almost exactly September of 1990.
They had $3 trillion, didn't they?
No, they did not have trillion. No. So no, but So, but probably if you sort of scale up by the size, relatively speaking, it's in that ballpark, LTCM ballpark.
So, what are we? what happened? Like, you are like the definitive expert here on the collateral situation, on the too big to fail element of like, where is the failure going to happen? Presumably, I think the market isn't
125 billion.
freaking.
By the way. I just looked it up. 125 billion is what LTC on that. So you're right.
Oh, there you go. So the market obviously is not freaking out as much as it should, apart from core commodity prices. So what I find interesting is that the banks are still not, like, the share prices of the banks are not panicking in my opinion, in commensurate sort of proportions. So there is this obvious expectation there's going to be a bailout. That is clearly what's happening, right? So that 1.5 trillion is going to have to be transferred to the public balance sheet. Absolutely.
That's why the banks are saying, "What me worry?" Because they know that this problem is so massive that even the politicians can see it coming. That there's going to be a socialization of this cost.
Where do these failures happen? Do they matriculate in the energy industry, or do they matriculate in the banks?
There are all sorts of change. That's the whole problem. These are very network, and so they can start one place and then go in all sorts of unpredictable directions. But so essentially, it could be a utility or a trading company that misses. So it gets wrong. Gets hit by an adverse price move. They don't have the cash to cover the margin call, so they fail, and then whoever they're connected to by credit relationships will fail. Also, weird things can happen in the sense, oh my God, there's a liquidity shortage, and so everybody basically holds on to their cash, and the entire system freezes up. And so, that's one way to think about it. Formal way economists think about it is that there are multiple equilibriums. So there's a equilibrium where people lend people money and everything's okay, and then there's an equilibrium where saying, no, I'm not going to lend anybody any money, and that's sort of the crisis situation. And essentially, there are a lot of ways that you can flip from one equilibrium to the other.
So my main question, Craig, is what are the CDSs of the energy industry?
Well, so that's the whole thing. They're very, sort of the very vanilla forward contracts, and even sort of contract, long-term contracts by suppliers, by masters, So but basically, it's that people have bought or sold power or gas for delivery into the future, sort of the most vanilla, generic type of contract. But so it's not the fact that the instruments themselves are complex and opaque and have sort of hidden booby traps in them. It's just that if you get in these extreme price volatility environments, that system can melt down.
Well, I just mean like where, like in the way that if you held credit default swaps,
right,
you became a billionaire when the whole market collapsed. Yep. What do you hold in this market then to become a billionaire?
So well,
I want trading advice, Craig.
Well, so you can see I'm just sitting here. I'm not talking from the mansion or the yacht from a Russian oligarch here. So with that caveat in mind, so basically, one bet that you could take, would be, for example, that hey, bet on policy, all right, and actually potentially go short energy in the anticipation that they're going to do something to try to crash the price. In which case you'd be like Michael Burry or whatever, or Paulson.
So buy on high leverage shorts against the price of oil. Okay, thank you.
Not so much oil. No, so electric European power. So go short on the EEX. Calendar 2023 German power contract.
I want to get to measure number 5. Because I don't know, Craig, can you stay with us for another 20 minutes or so? Yeah, perfect. So we'll keep going for another 20 minutes. I do want to get through the measures and
Izabella, some of the questions are related to the stuff we're doing. Do you want to hit a couple of those?
Exactly. But let's finish number 5 just to get that bit over, because number 5 is obviously the big one. Price cap. I've messed up that caption. I have to do it again. It's a price cap on Russian gas, right? So we aim at lowering the cost of gas. Therefore, we will propose a price cap on Russian gas. Of course, the objective is who wrote this? Of course, the objective is here very clear. They're like
sounded better in the original German, so but anyway.
Is Russian?
We all
Russian
know
gas-
that our sanctions are deeply grinding into the Russian economy with a heavy negative impact. I'm almost laughing, given like that is anyway. But Putin is partially buffering through fossil fuel revenues. So here the objective is we must cut Russia's revenues, which Putin uses to finance his atrocious war in Ukraine. Nobody disagrees with that, by the way. And now our work of the last months really pays off, because at the beginning of the war, if you looked at the imported gas, 40% of it was Russian gas since a long time. Today we are down to 9% only. This must be like a live speech because it's terribly written. Go on. What do you reckon?
So a couple of comments about it. So first of all, Putin has just basically said, basically zero gas, at least through Nord Stream 1. So, so that's, again, and also the idea behind these price caps is, hey, the Russians are essentially selling above their marginal cost. They'll continue to sell to us even if we pay them a lower price. And so that way we can reduce the price of Russian gas. But basically, though, Putin has to play along, right? And so basically right now Putin is saying, hey, we're not going to, we're going to take zero on a lot of our gas because we're not going to sell you any gas. And in order to punish you and to try to change your sanctions policy. So there's sort of a lot of embedded assumptions in this about how Putin and the Russians are going to react to the price cap. The other thing I would say is that in the short run, and this is one of the things in the second blog post I did last week, in the short run, it is true that in Germany, gas is at the margin, and it's the gas price that is driving the power price. That's not so much true in the UK. The UK, there's a big gap between the power price and the cost of the gas needed to generate. So it's in Britain. Right now it's a capacity situation. But if you look at the forward prices, the 2023 calendar prices, there's a big gap between the power price and the value of the gas required to generate it. And so that means that even if this would work, the problem is more as much a generation capacity problem as it is a fuel price problem. And so, so that particularly over the fourth quarter of this year and the first quarter of next year, even if it worked, which is highly doubtful, it would not address what the market is saying the real problem is.
Craig, if they're going to defunge gas, then why doesn't Russian gas just become Belarusian gas?
Well, that's the one thing about gas, because the pipeline infrastructure. So it's sort of harder to play shell games with gas than it is with oil, and to magically change the identity of oil. You can transfer oil at sea and do all sorts of other things to sort of try to conceal what the ultimate origin is. It's a lot harder to do that with gas because the pipeline infrastructure and the pipelines go through. Russian gas basically comes the old way, which is via Ukraine, ironically, and I haven't seen Putin's. Weirdly, that gas has continued to flow. The other way is through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline.
The Nordstrom's pipeline? Yeah,
the Nordstrom pipeline. Yeah, absolutely. So not the Nordstrom rack pipeline, the Nordstrom pipeline. So that comes from northern Russia, and whereas the gas from via Ukraine comes from Eastern Siberia mainly. So it's much harder to transform Russian gas into non-Russian gas.
So just generally, I'm going to get to the questions now from those who are watching, but just to give a big picture of what's going on with the gas. So obviously the deficit of Russian gas, even if we impose a price cap, that doesn't stop Russia selling. I mean, logistics are the problem here. So Russia can't just deviate and give the gas to China that easily because the pipelines all go in one way. Hang on, Josh. I've got a... can you go to Daddy, please? Sorry, my daughter has just ran in. You have a cat. I have a
cat also.
Cat.
Bring her
Josh,
on.
do you want us? No.
Leah!
Anonymity. Oh dear. Oh no, you don't know what you've done. This is the end of the podcast.
Hey, cutie.
Okay.
All right.
Let me. Okay, I'm going to put myself on mute. But the quick point was, Craig, can you explain? Don't do that. Can you just explain the deflection of the gas, because LNG from the US is making up the shortfalls at the moment. Right. That US layer, just wait. That US gas would have otherwise been going to Asia and China. So, what are the implications for America? And does America itself, suffer a shortage? And answer that question. And then, Josh, can you tackle the questions whilst I give her to her father?
I can.
Okay.
Bye, Leah.
All right. So, in terms of the United States, you mentioned bottlenecks earlier, Josh. So a major bottleneck is that U.S. LNG export capacity is maxed out, and so every molecule that we can export, we are exporting. Bottleneck was exacerbated by a fire at one of the LNG liquefaction facilities on the Gulf Coast a few months ago. So in the short run, it's not, what happens in Europe is not really going to affect the U.S. because we can't really respond to what's going on in Europe anymore. We're sort of at our maximum capacity to do that.
Craig, was that related to when Biden was talking to the French Prime Minister, and he was like, "We've talked to the Saudis. Like, it's really, you guys got to produce more in the U.S." Is that related to that? The fact that the whole world's kind of at capacity? Yes,
the whole world is at capacity, and so, but both in terms of oil, but also in terms of gas, and gas in terms of export gas, the gas that could go to Europe. The bottleneck is so you have to liquefy gas in order to export it, and so our liquefaction capacity is limited. So in the near to medium term, the medium to longer term, you would say, hey, this is a great signal to invest in more liquefaction capacity and the upstream gas production in order to support it. But that's where the administration, not so much explicitly, but just because of the implicit hostility, has disincentivized investment there.
And these liquefaction facilities around the world, like what percentage, like how many are there? Because it seems like when one has a fire, it just is super disruptive to the entire world's gas.
Well, because there's no excess capacity in the system. So one thing going down. There are a lot of them. So the three big producers, the United States only recently became the world's largest gas LNG exporter. So the big three are the United States, Qatar, and Australia. But also Algeria, Malaysia, some other places, UAE,
Venezuela?
No, Venezuela doesn't have an LNG. Trinidad, though, off the coast of Venezuela does. But so basically, the United States didn't export any gas, I think, until 2011. So this is like a new industry. I don't think the molecules actually left the U.S. until 2016. The U.S. is a relative newcomer on the stage. There are all sorts of projects that are under consideration and under development, but they're getting sort of the financing in order, et cetera, has proved to be difficult even in this relatively lucrative environment.
Given the global nature of the market for gas, does most gas enter the global supply chain, or do countries use it locally? For the most part?
So the LNG, LNG is basically been around, I think, for about 56, 57 years now. But it has always been a relatively modest proportion of total gas consumption. Most gas consumption is pipeline gas. And the internationalization, the globalization of the gas market is a relatively recent phenomenon.
That kind of puts us. So let's take a couple of comments, because I think this one is relevant. So someone asks about nuclear. So the question is, he'd love to hear the bull case for nuclear in order to open the mind of a price-driving liberal mother-in-law.
So he wants a nuclear car.
So I saw one of those on the Jetsons, I think. No. So here's the thing about nuclear, is that sort of economically, there's a great case from it, particularly if you're sort of a liberal person that is focused on reducing climate change, because as essentially a zero emission technology, nuclear checks that box. The problem has been that it's just, for a variety of reasons, a lot of them regulatory and political, even the nuclear projects that have been in development have proved to be enormously costly, beset by cost overruns, et cetera. So, in the southeast of the United States, there's been I think the cost has doubled or maybe tripled since the project was first mooted. So nuclear is one of those things that seems to be very attractive for many reasons, but sort of execution has been very poor. I think that the hope for nuclear is going to be in the development of sort of newer, smaller scale kinds of technologies, and a lot of people are working on that, but it hasn't gotten anywhere. So I would like to be bullish on nuclear. It's just proved that it proved to be very costly historically.
That's very interesting, but also it doesn't matter. We're on the verge of fusion.
Right. Well, yeah, so that would be another example in terms of if you wanted to make a bullish case. So let me sort of generalize it and say that I think that the future for traditional nuclear technology is problematic, but the upside is in technical innovation, whether it's being in small scale fission reactors or in fusion.
Okay, so that's nuclear. I've got a cool chart that someone made me that I want to show, but I can't figure out how to show it on this thing.
It's at the bottom. You go to share.
I've got to share, but how do I? Okay,
and then you select slides.
But I need to learn this bloody thing. Okay, so slides, and then but it won't upload a JPEG for some reason.
Oh no? Well then do video, maybe video file or share screen. Either one works. Share screen, I think allows you to share.
I always worry about sharing screens because it always goes a bit.
It gives you options. It gives you options. Just close your porn tabs first.
It's not that I'm worried about.
It's okay, Isabella. We all understand.
I can wall the embarrassment.
Share screen. Okay.
Whenever I share screen, I try to have something written on one of the tabs that's like an Easter egg for everybody. That's like just share, like.
I want it. Okay, but there's nothing on it. Why is there nothing on it? This is what I don't understand.
Craig, Isabella's like one of those congressmen who's trying to understand how iPhones work.
I'm annoyed. I'm going to send it to Josh. I'm going to just send you the chart, and you can figure
That's all right.
out.
I'll do it. I'll share. I have some great tabs open. People will love to look through these.
I'm sending you the chart that I want to share, and you can figure out how to show it. There you go. So the next question, whilst Josh brings up my nice chart, because he's more technically literate than I am.
Did you send it to Signal? I just heard my phone go.
Yeah, it's on Signal. Where else was I going to send it?
Send it to my Gmail.
Oh God, really? That's going to take at least another 5 minutes.
Oh, don't do it then. I'll figure it out. Isabella, it's going to be seamless for you. I'm going to disappear for a second.
Okay. Anyway, the next question is not to do with nuclear. It's, do you have any comments on the hydrogen generation efforts that Canada and Germany are undertaking?
My comment was to laugh. I mean, it's, so, I mean, it goes back to the LNG discussion, Pierre Castro, Trudeau, said no, there's no business case for LNG exports from Canada to Germany. But, well, we're going to support hydrogen. Well, I quite frankly don't see the business case for hydrogen either. It's again, it's something a lot of people are working at, but the economics are sketchy at best. Particularly if you want to talk about green hydrogen, which is, I think, what they're talking about. Again, you run into sort of energy density issues and all sorts of things, and so I think hydrogen has been on the horizon, and I anticipate that it will be on the horizon almost.
So another question, I think this is a good one. What happens to house prices when everyone can't afford to heat their homes? Do we go back to multi-generational living? I think generally speaking, I'm going to add my question to this, which is also what happens to house mortgages, and why aren't the banks panicking? Because I can't understand how anyone's going to be able to pay their mortgage. Why are we not having people panicking about subprime defaults and all the, I know all these capital measures were taken post GFC, but I just think this is on such a level that I think it's going to be broad brush potential property nationalization, which sounds extreme, but I don't see how you can get out of it in any other way.
Well, so I guess one way of framing that would be that the politician's going to have to socialize the cost, and that's what they're going to do one way or the other. And I think what the banks are betting on now is that the socialization of the cost is going to be, first of all, directed at the energy companies like we directed, and second of all, basically, put on the on the backs of future taxpayers, and so that that the banks are betting, at least by revealed preference here, that that the governments are somehow going to shield them via the housing market or any other channel from the implications of this.
In that case, though, I suspect it's very different in America. So America is obviously more resilient because you are energy resilient still.
And we're awesome.
And you're awesome. Yes. But the UK is fairly resilient because we've still got North Sea gas, but we've got that marginal barrel issue because we're not fully resilient. But really, I think in the UK, the mortgage situation is far more precarious. So I would imagine we've got 30% of the population has mortgaged housing, right? So I don't know what the proportions are in America, but that seems to me I can't imagine, even if Liz, and let's go to what Liz is doing. So Liz is our new prime minister, by the way. I don't know if you heard, Josh, we've got a new prime minister.
I heard. I'm surprised. I don't know how you got rid of that other guy. I liked him. His hair was
Joe. His hair was all crazy. So we're now living under two Elizabeths. Elizabeth.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, we love an Elizabethan leader over here. It's one of the things we do. Elizabeth I, Elizabeth II, Elizabeth Truss.
You'll be heating your homes with Elizabethan technologies.
Exactly. So Liz has also come in with some measures today. Let me tell you about them. Liz, good old Liz. So we were waiting. So I think a lot of the industry was just waiting for the appointment of the new leader, because this is why things are not as panicked as I would have thought, because clearly they're expecting, like, furlough set a precedent. I mean, we're beyond moral hazard, right? So Prime Minister Liz Truss is understood to be planning to borrow billions to limit the expected sharp rise in energy bills for households and firms. It is understood that a typical energy bill could be capped at around £2,500, with full details expected on Thursday. Currently, a typical household's gas and electricity bill is due to rise from £1,971 to £3,549 in October.
Pictures ready.
The support package she's planning is about 100 billion. Now, that strikes me. I think furlough was 70 billion here in the UK. So that is a significantly larger sum. And I mean, the capping of the energy is just the inheritance of that energy short onto the public balance sheet as well. It's not like
Izabella, the picture's ready, by the way. So just
excellent. This is a good picture. Go on, put it up.
I can't. You have to put it up.
I have to do it. I have to do it already. Oh, it's not very good. It's too small.
Well, I'll make it bigger.
Make it bigger. How do I do
I'm working on it. I am the master of making things bigger.
There you go. So this was knocked up for me. Let me take this banner away.
You need it smaller?
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. So basically, this was like knocked up by one of. By the way, if you're not on my Discord, do join. It's the Blind Spot Discord. Details are probably on my Twitter or on the Blind Spot website, which is the-blindspot.com. Unfortunately, an annoying hyphen in there, which prevents me from doing I trip over it. It's very annoying. But when I'm rich and famous, we'll buy the actual blindspot.com. But anyway, it's a cool chart because it tracks the different, like, just how everyone was laughing here in the UK a few months, like last summer, when there was a petrol panic, and everyone with petrol cars couldn't get any petrol, and everyone with electric cars was going, ha ha, see, this is why electric's better. But I look at that chart now, and like the Mercedes is doing pretty well. That's the Mercedes C200, whatever. I'm not a car person, but I'm presuming that's a petrol or diesel car. So, I mean, with that kind of exposure in your electric car, no one's going to be using an electric car. I don't see how that's going to be a viable mode of transport for anybody.
Buy diesel.
Don't get me started on the sort of the diesel, the European diesel thing. Hey, let's everybody die of diesel. All non-diesel is bad, so we can't use it anymore. And another example, California. So California passed a mandate that all cars sold in California by 2035, I think, have to be electric. And then like a couple days later, they sent out an announcement due to this power issue: don't charge your electric car because we're short on power. And so, this is an example of the, sort of the misphasing of the transition. So what's the thing in the UK? Don't, mind the gap. Okay. So they're not minding the gap. All right. So we're supposed to step into an electrified future, and there's a big gap in the capacity available to provide it. And going back to trust, I mean, so again, this is just different forms of socialization. So she's basically advocating putting it on the public balance sheet. And again, the one issue about that is, okay, if you're capping consumers' prices, that doesn't give them an incentive to reduce consumption, and so then you're running into the rationing issue again. And that was one thing that, at least in the article that you sent me, that I saw missing, is, well, how are they going to bridge that gap? So
I just don't know. And we're coming up to like probably finishing time, but it squares, I think, the conversation quite nicely, because we started off with how is it that the politicians are like so behind the curve? Is it a case of incompetence? Are they should know better? The economists who are advising them and in positions of power should know better. Why are they barefaced lying to us? Why don't they just come out and say the obvious, which is you're going to have rationing? That there's nothing that's going to solve this problem other than fuel and power rationing. And that's probably going to take the form of some sort of lockdown, de facto lockdown, because you won't be able to do, the things that you wanted to do. And let's face it, during lockdown, energy consumption did go down. So there's a nice precedent for them. Now, lockdown for COVID, in the fear context of COVID, I think was palatable. But I guess where I'm getting at is, at what point do you think the public is going to realize that this is all bullshit, or do you think they already know? And
no, I don't. So you look at the history of politics of adoption of price controls over the years. Most people are not really aware of the linkage between a true shortage, that is, people like lining up in the images in the background here, and price controls. I think most politicians, at least on some level, understand that, at least at the level of von der Leyen or Truss or people like that. But precisely because they realize that most consumers, most individuals are not so aware of the connection, that they're not going to want to advertise it.
So is this a question of propaganda? Like, are we at the point where these people who we know they know better, so they are involved in some sort of, what do you like to call it, Josh? Kabuki theater?
Oh, is that my word?
I don't know. I thought it was. Yes.
No, I mean, and so I mean, I remember when we talked about sort of the smart, whatever it was that von der Leyen said. And so that was an Orwellian framing of rationing,
which will be a technological tool this time, and it will be in the style of a vaccine passport, I suspect.
So something like that, and so they're trying to get the political credit right now. See, we're saving you. We're going to give you all this money to offset these high costs, and so don't read the fine print, which we're not going to disclose to you about what the ultimate consequences of that are going to be.
Do you think we will see civil unrest in Europe?
I don't. I mean, so you've seen, episodic breakouts of it in recent years, and Dutch farmers recently, Gilets in France, and so it appears that the possibility is there, but this is like a phase shift. I mean, this is potentially at such a higher level that I can't exclude it. So predicting civil unrest, civil disobedience is a very hard thing. It's another one of those sort of multiple equilibrium situations, and it's kind of hard to predict when that's going to flip over. But certainly let's put it this way: I think the necessary conditions will be there in spades.
You see, because what I, as a media practitioner, sense, and this may be just me seeing things where there is nothing. So I'm. If you disagree with me, please tell me. But it feels to me like the messaging has already started. Like the mainstream is very much like, if you read the Daily Mail or whatever, there is like police fear, massive civil unrest. Parliament is planning contingencies for if and when they run out of power, they're going to use carbon copy paper. I mean, this is the level of messaging we are like. I feel maybe it's because I'm very jaded and cynical, but I feel like that is almost a conscious fear creation situation. I would like to think that based on the reaction to COVID and how cohesive we were, I thought I was quite surprised by how cohesive and rule abiding the population was. I was expecting more disruption back in COVID, and obviously furlough probably pacified a lot of people that would otherwise have been rebelling or protesting. But But I think this time I sense it the other way around. I feel like the media is almost encouraging this idea of people being fearful that there's going to be civil collapse, and therefore maybe that's like a conscious or unconscious. I don't believe in like media conspiracies necessarily. I think it's all like the product of peer pressure and like unconscious they respond from each other. It's a sort of it's not like a top down, like having been in the media, I know there's no like top down conspiracy. It doesn't work like that. It's more like a peer pressure groupthink thing, but there seems to be this groupthink about like creating the sense that there is going to be massive civil unrest, and that's weird because that serves the agenda of Putin. Like nobody benefits from propagating the idea that Europe is going to be like collapsing in a month's time more than Putin, right? And secondly, it creates a sense of fear that I think will make people more likely to respond to, maybe that's what they're hoping, is that when they then put out their protocols about not eating dinner until 8 p.m. or whatever, that people will then, they'll get enough dutiful citizens who are fearful of riots corresponding. So maybe it is all a big Jedi mind trick, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. So maybe, like you say, sort of a reverse psychology way of trying to deter, civil unrest. But you mentioned by being cynical. In these contexts, I'm always reminded of Lily Talman, who says, "We try to be cynical, but it's hard to keep up." And so I think that this is particularly, if there's a time to try to, to really keep up on being cynical, I think what's going on now is that time.
So one last question, because we can't get through them all, but there is one worthwhile question that I think is worth still addressing. What happens to the developing world? What's the situation there? Like, obviously, you would think Europe has the capacity to buy the marginal barrel. Are we going to displace barrels or energy from the developing world, or is there like what happens over there?
So that's a couple of things about sort of gas and electricity in particular is it's much more localized, and so Europe's gas problems are based on availability of gas on the continent, which can't go anywhere else, Russian gas. And the bottlenecks of getting gas into Europe, and now there are bottlenecks both at the liquefaction end, but also at the gasification end in Europe. And also, electricity is basically a local commodity. So, to the extent that it's a gas and power crisis, it will be largely localized to Europe. And see what's going on in the oil market right now. The oil price of WTI, I think, was down below 85 today. Brent is down below 90. So the oil market is very bearish. So in that respect, there's a disconnect between what's going on in the gas and power markets in Europe and what's going on in the oil market worldwide. So at least in the foreseeable future, this is first and foremost a European problem, which will have relatively little spillover, except through indirect channels like Europe goes into a big recession, and that has spillover effects. But sort of the direct energy market channel is it's a European issue.
Will we get European refugees going to Africa?
Yeah. So sort of returning on the boat to Libya or something. I don't go that far, but it might though reduce the flow from Africa.
No, I mean actual Western Europeans, like.
Well, no, that's what I said. Well, but so maybe some that can go to the United States or Canada or Australia might choose to go there. But certainly not reversing the flow to Africa, but it might reduce the flow from Africa and the Middle East.
We'll ask, because Josh is obviously a transparent Bitcoin maxi, what happens to crypto in this context and its energy, massive energy consumption issue? Obviously, no one's going to be operating mining companies or miners in Europe, presumably. But Josh, do you think there's a crypto angle here we're not considering?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that people don't realize is that crypto incentivizes the building of stranded energy. areas. Like if there's a place in Europe that you could build solar energy and the land is very cheap and the cost would be very good, people will do that, right? And they won't connect to the grid. They'll connect it directly to mines. Like right now, miners are basically working with people in the Permian Basin down by you to do things like flare gas mining.
Yep.
And to build robust, the
Yep.
robust ability to actually to move energy into into usable places. So what that means basically is that you have the ability to consume electricity at whatever level you need, which is important for a grid. If energy consumption is too low, that energy just goes into ground.
Yeah.
So Bitcoin allows you to actually make money from the energy that would have otherwise gone to ground. And I think that's really, I think what's going to end up happening with energy grids once Bitcoin kind of ends up figuring itself out is that you'll have energy plans sort of like how cities and counties plan highways, where you'll have a 30-year infrastructure plan where they can pre-build energy infrastructure and at a cost that is de minimis as a result of this stuff. And that's kind of how I see it going. Is that stupid, or is that a reasonable inference?
Yeah, that's but it will be driven though. So as long as there's a sustainable demand for Bitcoin and crypto, particularly proof of work type systems. So so that will work if there's a demand for the crypto.
Well, as an economist, though, wouldn't it make sense that all mining, all proof of work mining will eventually basically be green and neutral? Because if you think about it, like there's no real, like it's not the best use of burning energy in your home, right? Like you want that energy to go to the toaster, right? Or your oven or your TV. But so the energy globally has kind of this, specific high price, but for stranded energy and energy that is that would otherwise go to ground, I saw this with diesels when French fry oil was realized that it could power diesels. And I was a waiter at the time at Ruby Tuesday in Minnesota. And I remember we used to pay someone to come and get the French fry oil every night. And then eventually I offered to take my Passat TDI and take their French fry oil on my own and filter it and put it in my car. And then construction companies, all of whose cars run on diesel, realized that they could they could save a huge amount in diesel and gas expenses by going around and basically providing the service and paying restaurants for their diesel. So I got out competed, and I could no longer find French fry oil for my car. So I've seen this sort of market develop, and it seems to me that Bitcoin's kind of going to have the exact same thing happen, where this stranded energy is $0 right now. It just goes right into the ground. The earth takes care of the capacity and the excess capacity. And then eventually what will happen is miners will come around and they'll say, well, you know what, we'll take that energy and we'll pay you a de minimis amount. And then what you'll have are miners competing on how much the energy company is ultimately going to get back and what the cost of that stranded and ground energy would have otherwise been. So that to me seems to be the future of that. And, I might be wrong. I don't know anything about energy, but
I would frame it in another way. So what's one of the problems with electricity in particular is the storability issue. And so basically what you're describing is essentially a way of storing by basically transforming energy at low cost that's available at low cost but can't be stored into something else that can be stored and generates value. So whether it's mining at night or like you say, stranded resources that otherwise would not have load to support them. Now those are basically Bitcoin can be viewed as an energy storage technology.
Minus the fact that you can't get the energy back, right? But you can get, but the money can subsidize energy creation and future infrastructure creation. I would think in that way, you're correct. Like that to me is essentially what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is, entropy turned into value.
I mean, this is a good, I'm going to have to go soon myself, but I think it's a good way to round things off, because I think, given we have touched on the fact that this rationing system is no doubt going to come in, I think it feeds into the Bitcoin story. I mean, I was obviously one of a massive critic. I think, Craig, you yourself were quite, cynical and skeptical of Bitcoin. But I do think, in the context of, like, look at the pictures we've got behind us. Like in the Soviet Union, when we had rationing,
look at the pictures.
yeah, black markets obviously emerged as a result of the fact that rationing is never efficient, and there's always corruption in any subjectively kind of managed economy, right? So I can see Bitcoin, the rationale for like Bitcoin becoming the new mechanism for black market exchange, and reviving the role that the dollar used to play in the USSR, where the only neutral currency that you could rely on was the dollar, mainly because it didn't discriminate against who used it, right? They didn't care if, like, the Stasi were using it, or whether, it was good like secret capitalists or resistance. The point was, it was neutral. It had a neutrality factor to it. And yes, a lot is made of the fact that Bitcoin is used by bad people and drug dealers and scammers. But that is kind of like, for me, my big epiphany is that if you want the capacity to use a currency when you yourself end up inadvertently repressed or unable to, utilize a neutral currency, you have to take the bad with the good, kind of thing. What do you think?
Also, bad policies make bad people, right? Because that's the whole black markets. So those are bad people. Well, why are black markets created? Because the white markets, if you will, are suppressed. So.
Did I convert you, Craig? Are you now a Bitcoin maximalist?
I'm not a maximalist. I'm never a maximalist about anything. I'm Aristotle, So like, So.
Have you gone? I mean, I'm interested to know. Have you gone a bit more open-minded on it?
No, I'm open-minded. I've always been open-minded. I'm still, somewhat skeptical about whether Bitcoin itself is going to be the crypto of the future, or whether there's going to be some other crypto. My main concern in sort of the digital space, if you will, is central bank digital currencies. I mean, that's the thing that gives me neuralgia. So.
Yes, exactly. And there was a very good thing that went viral the other day. Like, I can't remember who it was, but it was some central banker sort of admitting that they're relatively useless. There's no real technological use case or reason to implement a CBDC unless you want to actually help with the rationing issue. That is their main use case.
The only reason for CBDCs is rationing. That's what no one realizes yet. And like, it's very funny when you start like thinking about it. You're like, oh, the purpose of it, because we already have a cashless society for the most part. Cash is optional, and so this idea that you need like a CBDC, all it is cash that is electronic, that goes into the user's hand. So it's like a bank account at the Fed. It's really no different.
Yeah.
And the only purpose of a bank account at the Fed is rationing. Yeah.
Well, on that cheery note, go on, Craig. You have the last word.
Just always look on the bright side of life. Yeah.
Appropriate, because it's about the fall of Rome. I mean, not quite. There's Jesus, right?
I think it's about Jesus.
It's about Jesus, but what did the Romans do for us?
Yeah, there you go. So.
Okay. Well, that was very informative. Thank you for joining us. Sorry, go on, Greg. Go.
I was just doing more Life of Brian quotes.
Well, is it great? If whoever has not seen The Life of Brian, it's a must watch. Excellent film, of course. Anyway, thank you, Craig, for joining us. I hope we answered some questions, enlightened somebody out there, and stay tuned to The Blind Spot. We've got some great podcasts coming up. We've had a busy summer. Packaging away a lot of content, so it'll be coming out soon. I have a feeling September and October is going to be pretty busy. So if you want to stay on top of the signal rather than the noise, do consider also joining the Discord community that I run. You'll find the details on the-blindspot.com. World's worst domain name, I know. Sorry about that.
And we are near a a landmark for ourselves. We would like to be able to do super chats, which means that you pay us to ask questions, which we would like. So if you are into that too, if you want to pay us rather than asking these free questions, then go ahead and subscribe to the channel. We need 1,000 people, so we're almost there. We're just a little bit under, and once we get there, then we'll be able to do more live
very
stuff.
good points. Subscribe, and every one of these I've started to show my heritage, because I just found all these ration books from old school Polish times.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so
you can't see them, but the real thing is one of the reasons that we don't do as many live shows is because the super chats are not something that are active for us yet. We would love to do more live shows, and we would love to be able to prioritize questions and give you guys the opportunity to ask them in that way. So please subscribe and be back.
I'm chilling. Someone's asking, where can we find you, Craig? You run the incredibly successful Streetwise Professor blog. What's the URL? Remind me.
www.streetwiseprofessor.com. And
Brilliant.
I'm on Twitter at streetwiseprof.
Excellent.
And I'm Robert the Schiller.
And do follow Craig. He's really very good. He has he's excellent. He's the go-to expert, I would say, in the market. So thank you very much, everybody. Take care until another podcast. Sayonara.
Thanks.
Bye.
And